Kia ora everyone, and welcome back to the IA Max channel. Ahmed Mohi here. In this video, I'll talk about the Azure CLI or the Azure command line and how to use it to create and manage Azure resources on Microsoft Azure. So let's dive in. So what is the Microsoft Azure CLI? Microsoft Azure CLI, or the command line interface, is a set of commands that you can use to create and manage resources on Microsoft Azure. It is very intuitive and it's very easy to understand. And it also helps you to manage almost all of the Azure services on Microsoft Azure. An example here is a command that is telling the Microsoft Azure to create a resource group called IAMAX-RG and then to host it in the Australia East region. One of the benefits of the Azure CLI is the speed of deployment. So creating a resource using the GUI is a great, easy way to create a resource. But if you have more than one resource that you want to create, so let's say that you've got 10 virtual machines or more, so creating one machine each time will take 5 minutes or more. So multiply that by 10, it becomes 50 minutes. But if you have the code ready, you just paste in the code and you have 5 virtual machines at one time. So the Azure CLI would help you with the speed of deployment, will also help you with the standardization. So if you create the same resource and you want to get the same result each time, like a virtual machine, and you want to always have the same setting, you could put that in a code and then use it as a template. So each time you want to create a virtual machine, you just use that template to make sure that you will always get the same configuration for your resource. And this is also a very good first step for your enterprise, because for what is called infrastructure as code, as you could use the infrastructure as code to standardize all the deployment of the resources they've got on Azure, whether it's a virtual machine or anything else. So you could use the template that you use to create one virtual machine to make it a standard, and then this will help you with the infrastructure as code. I'll talk about the infrastructure as code methodology in a future video. Now let's talk a little bit about the syntax of the Azure CLI. So for a start, all the commands start with the leading AZ, which stands for Azure. And then basically you've got three main pieces of the command, which is what is the scope, or what is called the reference name, and what the action or the command. So in our case here, when we say the AZ, okay, the reference name is let's say virtual machine, which is a VM, or a VNet, network VNet, or a group for resource groups. And then what is it that you want to do? What is the action? You want to create a virtual machine, or you want to delete a virtual machine, and so on. Well, the full syntax of the Azure CLI. So let's say that you want to create a virtual machine. So you start with the AZ, and then you put the VM to tell the Microsoft Azure that you want to work on VMs, and then create. So you want to create a VM with the name, you give it the name, the value of the name. The -- name here is called a parameter. So you start with the AZ and the reference name, and then the command, which is create in this case, and then the parameter, which is a name, or it could be the resource group, and then you give the value for that parameter. And in our case here, the name is the IAMAX VM, and then the resource group is the IAMAX RG. Next, I want to talk a bit about the formatting of the Azure CLI. So you could type in the command all in one line. So for example, here we've got the AZ VM create, then you give the name, and then you give what is the resource group. Or you could put each parameter on a line. So in our case here, we are saying like AZ VM create, and then the first parameter, the name, you put it on a line, and then the second parameter, the resource group, you put it on another line. To tell Microsoft Azure command line that this is not the end of the command, you use the \. So you're basically telling the CLI that there is more to come. So for example, in this case, you said AZ VM create, and then the \. So it's expecting more information, and then you tell it the -- name, IAMX and then another backslash, so still more parameters to come. The last line doesn't have any backslash, which means that this is the end of the command. After this, when you hit enter, the Microsoft Azure CLI would run your command. Finally, let's talk about where to run the Azure CLI. So there are two places that you could run the Azure CLI on. So you could either use the Azure Cloud Shell, which we could find on in the Azure portal. So once you are inside the Azure portal, next to the Azure portal search, you'd see this symbol, and it's like a command line. So if you click on it, it will open up this window, and you could start to type in your Azure CLI commands. One thing to put in mind is that when you do that for the first time, Microsoft Azure will ask you to create a storage account to keep your configuration. So if you change any configuration in the command line and you want to keep it, you want to save it, so like each time you open up the Cloud Shell, it will have your configuration there ready. It will need to store it in somewhere on your account, and this will incur a monthly cost. So just put that in mind. Where I use the Azure Cloud Shell is that if so for example, if I was on the go, so if this is not my laptop and you just have access to the to a web browser, so you want to run some commands, so from the Azure portal, just click on the Azure Cloud Shell and then you start running the commands in there. Or if you can't actually install the Azure CLI, which is the second method, or locally install it on your machine, either you don't have the admin rights to install it on your machine, or for a security reason, for example, you don't trust that machine and you don't want to run code on top of it, so you would use the Azure Cloud Shell instead. The other method is to actually install what is called the Azure CLI. So you just go to the Microsoft website of aka.ms, install Azure CLI Windows, download the MSI file, as you can see here, and then install it. And once you do that, you could run your Azure CLI either from your PowerShell or from a command prompt. So you just open up the command prompt and then start typing your code. But for you to be able to do that, you need to connect your Azure account with your local computer, and I'll show you that in a second. Now that we are ready, let's see how we could start using the Azure CLI. Now that we are inside the Azure portal, let's open up the Azure Cloud Shell. So let's click on the Cloud Shell icon. As you can see here, when you first open up the Azure Cloud Shell, it's going to ask you to create a storage account for it to store your configuration. So click on Create Storage Account. And as you can see here, it is succeeding, and now it's connecting to the CLI. And just like that, we are now ready to use the Azure CLI. So what we want to do here is that we want to create a VNet and then create a virtual machine inside that VNet. I have already prepared the code for that, so I'll just bring it up. As you can see here, we are going to create a VNet and then create a VM. This is the Visual Studio Code, and I'm using an extension to color the code for the Azure CLI. So as you can see here, it is saying Azure CLI, and the way to install the extension is just to click on extension here and then type in Azure CLI, install this extension, and you will get like help, and if you type in the command wrong, it will tell you where you made a mistake. This will be really helpful for you if you want to start typing and learn the Azure CLI. So what are we trying to do here basically is that we want to create a VNet. We will call it IAMX VNet. We'll put it in a resource group called IAMX, and we will create a subnet inside of it called the IAMX subnet. For the VM, we'll put it into, the resource group is IAMX, and we will call it IAMX VM. I will use Windows 2019 Windows Server Data Center. We'll give it a public IP address we will put it into the VNet IAMX VNet, and then for the subnet we'll use the IAMX subnet, and this is the username and this is the password. So first let's create the VNet. So let's copy this and let's go inside our research group, and as you can see here we have nothing here. So in here we're going to paste the code, and it's going to give us an output message telling us that it created the VNet and tell us the details about the VNet that it just created. Yeah, so it just succeeded now, and as you can see here, this is all the details about the VNet that Azure just created for us. And if we refresh here, it'll take just a second. Yeah, as you can see here, we've got our VNet here just created. Now we are ready to create our virtual machine. So let's bring in the code for the virtual machine and copy it, and again paste it here. And as you can see here, now we have created our virtual machine. And so if we refresh our resource group, as you can see here, we have our virtual machine created. So let's click on our virtual machine here to find more details about it. So as you can see here, it is the Windows Server 2019 that we just created. This is the IP address that the public IP address that I got. This is the virtual network and the subnet that we have assigned it, and so on. I hope you found this video useful, and if you have any comments or questions, please leave them in the comments below, and as always, stay strong, care. See ya.